Today at the National Press Club, White House and national security correspondent David E. Sanger. He's worked as a New York Times journalist for 42 years and is discussing the new Cold Wars, China's rise, Russia's invasion and the struggle to defend the West. David Sanger with today's Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name is Andrew Tillett and I'm the Defence and Foreign Affairs Correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and also Vice President here at the club. Our guest today is Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist David Sanger, who has been a journalist for more than 40 years with reporting stints in Washington DC, Silicon Valley and Japan on his resume. During his career, David has been part of 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning teams, including one that investigated the Challenger space shuttle disaster and most recently, Russian interference in the 2016 US election. David has reported on 5 US presidents and is currently the national security correspondent for the Times. So what could he possibly have to talk about given how predictable and boring US politics is at the moment? Seriously though, it is great to have him here, that he's still managed to find time to come to Australia given the US is amidst so much turmoil and one of its most consequential election campaigns ever. David is currently visiting Australia as a visiting fellow for Sydney University's United States Studies Centre as he promotes his latest book, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion and America's Struggle to Defend the West, which examines the great geopolitical contest of our time. You can follow today's conversation at Press Club Ost or hashtag NPC, and we have lots to talk about, so please everyone welcome David Sanger to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you all for coming here today. It is terrific to be back in Australia. It's great to be back in Canberra. I've just been down in Sydney for a couple of days talking about the book and catching up with old friends. I want to thank a few folks for getting me here. You heard in the introduction I came over for the U.S. Studies program at the University of Sydney, and Mike Green and Jared Monshine, who's here with us today. I want to thank them, and I want to thank all of you at the Press Club for giving me the moment to come talk to everybody. It's a really great time to be out of Washington and back here. There's not really much going on at home, and so I thought it'd be a good time to sort of slip out unnoticed. We will, I'm sure, in the Q&A, and I'll get to it a little bit at the end of my talk, discuss a bit about the presidential election and where we're headed now. It's hard for me to believe that it was only, I guess, 6 weeks ago or so that I was returning from the G7 summit and the president was heading into his debate prep. And only about 5 weeks ago that he had the pretty public meltdown during the debate. And of course, in the interim, we had the assassination attempt on former President Trump. Fortunately, that had a good ending, but boy, it was a very scary moment there. It were only 2 weeks and a couple of days since the president decided to drop out, and we're a few hours out since Kamala Harris decided who her vice presidential running mate would be. So it's been a pace that I can't really remember in what this August will be 43 years at the Times. But let me talk first a little bit about the geostrategic situation that is going to meet whoever wins this election. Because it is not only the most complex set of superpower challenges that I can recall, but I actually think, and the reason that I wrote this book, is that it is both much more unstable than the original Cold War and much more dangerous than the original Cold War. And so let me talk to you for a moment about why I said that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the reporting and the findings as I worked away with my research associate and co-writer Mary Brooks on putting together this book, which came out in the States in April, and here just a month or so later. The old Cold War, which a couple of you in the room, but I won't name any names, look like you may recall, but most of you don't, was notable because it was a conflict between two nuclear-armed adversaries. It was primarily a military conflict, and within that it was primarily a nuclear conflict. And while it was terrifying and had terrifying moments, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, it settled into something of a pattern over time. There was a predictability to it. We knew in the United States that if Americans did X in such a place in the world, the reaction could be pretty well predicted. There were proxy wars, of course, Korea, Vietnam, the list goes on. But at the same time, we were usually able to avoid and talk to each other about avoiding direct conflict. We didn't rely on our adversary, the Soviet Union, for anything. Well, that's not true. We relied on them for vodka and caviar, and we would not want to give those things up, for sure, but we could have sort of made our way through without them. The new Cold Wars, what we find ourselves in now, quite different. We have two major adversaries who are, for the first time, really working together. Not always smoothly, not in a true alliance, but in a partnership. That's wildly different from what happened in the old Cold War, and in fact, the Nixon-Kissinger effort to open up relations with China was based very much on the thought of interfering with that relationship. And I, as the author of Henry Kissinger's obit in the Times, which wasn't quite a book, but some people accused it of being book length. I spoke to Kissinger about this a lot because I interviewed him repeatedly for the obituary, and in the last few months of his life, he was concerned that the biggest experiment, that geopolitical experiment that he was responsible for, was in fact unwinding. But that's not the only difference between the old Cold War and the new. We are highly dependent, obviously, on China for a range of goods, and they are highly dependent on us, and particularly on Australia, for everything from fundamental minerals to, in the case of the United States, chip designs. We are in a position right now where the relationship with China has gotten so bad that just a few weeks ago, the Chinese told the United States that they were breaking off discussions not on arms control, but on nuclear arms safety. That is to say, those things you would do, hotlines, warning each other of military exercises or missile tests to avoid an accident. We have begun to have the most halting conversations with China about the dangers of artificial intelligence and why you might not want to, for example, use AI in nuclear command and control scenarios. But the Chinese at this point are so suspicious of American intentions and Western intentions that these conversations so far have been at best preliminary, and most people don't think they're going to go very far. And our relationship with Russia, a country with whom we once cooperated on containing North Korea's nuclear program, During the Iran negotiations in 2015, the Russians and the Chinese sat on the U.S.-European side of the table to go negotiate with Iran. The chances that that could happen again today seem infinitesimal. In fact, if we did get negotiations going again with Iran now, I think the Russians and the Chinese would be at the table, but not on the American and European side. They would be sitting on the Iranian side. And of course, we've seen Iran and North Korea supplying Russia for the war in Ukraine. And now we've seen China supplying electronics, not weapons, but much of the technology needed to rebuild the Russian military. This is a dramatically different scenario than the one that we had expected. Very different from the way we thought the world was going to unfold. What did we think? Well, I came back to Washington in 1994 after 6 delightful years as the Tokyo correspondent and then the Tokyo bureau chief for the Times. Delightful because I enjoyed Japan, but really delightful because it gave me an excuse to come here to Australia very often, frequently to write about Japan's influence throughout Asia. This was the time period when we thought that Japan was really going to be the largest influencer within the region. But the world that we expected to find when I got back to Washington was one that bears almost no resemblance to what I just described to you before. When I got to Washington, there was an underlying assumption that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with China beginning to rise as a manufacturing power and with aspirations to be a technological power, that both countries would basically adopt to the Western design system. They were not going to become Jeffersonian democracies. They weren't going to look like Australia or Japan or even what South Korea at the time was beginning to become. But they would fundamentally operate by Western designed rules. China entered the WTO. There was discussion that Russia would become part of the European Union and that one day it might even enter NATO. And this wasn't just casual discussion. As I've made my way around the world talking about new Cold Wars, I've run into one American official and one British official, both very senior, who told me that they had actually been assigned to go write lengthy memorandums for presidents and prime ministers and so forth about how you would integrate Russia into NATO. I mean, it's almost unimaginable to us today. So the question is, what did we miss? And what were the big turning points here? So when I set out to write New Cold Wars, what I wanted to do was two things. First, go back over the 30 years that I have covered since I arrived in Washington, but spent much of that time, as you heard, covering 5 presidents, but also traveling around the world, to answer the question, what did we get wrong? Was this an intelligence failure? Was it just wishful thinking that this is how the world would work out? Was it projection of American values? We do this a lot in our country, toward the rest of the world, that since it made sense for us to export goods around the world, certainly the Russians wouldn't risk giving up the European gas and oil markets. Certainly the Chinese wouldn't risk their export markets simply to gain new territory or to repress ethnic minorities or to expand their influence around the world. The economic drive would be just too great. And there was a second underlying assumption, And that assumption was that as the internet took hold, remember this was the early 90s and people were just beginning to think about its possibilities, that it would fundamentally undercut totalitarian or authoritarian regimes. I remember going with Bill Clinton to Beijing. He took several trips. In fact, every American president I've covered except President Biden has been to Beijing, some more than once. And on one of Clinton's last trips, he went to Beijing University, and he told the students there that the internet will set you free because it will undercut the authority of the Communist Party of China. It will make it obvious to Chinese around the country how the rest of the world lives. It will result in political liberalization. The internet, he said, and the information that flows through it is so ubiquitous that trying to censor it, he said, would be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Well, it turns out that the leaders of the Communist Party of China are some of the world's greatest Jell-O nailers. They turned the technologies that flowed from connectivity, facial recognition, the ability to pick out emails, to be highly efficient in tracking people and their cell phones. These all turned out to be critical steps in holding a new form of authoritarian rule over their people. In fact, it turned out to be so effective that they now export it. You can buy a telecommunications package from Huawei, but you can get with it the technologies to go track your people. And this has been one of the allures for the Chinese of selling their systems in many societies. And we have the same thought about Russia, that Putin himself was ultimately a pragmatist. Yeah, he may have been raised in the KGB, but George Bush looked into his eyes and saw somebody he thought he could go deal with. We thought we understood that Putin would, in the end, just as a matter of political expediency, choose economic expansion of Russia over any of his desires to reestablish the empire of Peter the Great. The high point of that thinking, as I went back over my own reporting, came in June of 2002. I went to St. Petersburg with President Bush, and it was shortly after 9/11. Bush was traveling the world trying to gain allies in his war on terrorism. And one evening, he and Laura Bush and Putin and his then wife took a yacht trip down the Neva River in St. Petersburg. It was one of those, for those of you who've been there in the early summer, it was one of those endless nights where it seemed like the sun was never going to set. It only did briefly. And it was a beautiful scene as they floated past the Hermitage and the beauty of St. Petersburg. And they were eating and enjoying themselves. I was in the pool in a backup boat. We were not eating or drinking as well. But we briefly went on the main yacht to see the scene. And during that trip, as I reconstructed events later on, there was actually discussion of what it would take for Russia to join the EU and what the timetable would be. There was an assumption that their military would somehow integrate or work with NATO. In fact, there was a Russia-NATO council that you used to be able to go visit just inside the gates of the NATO headquarters in Brussels so that they could coordinate and be on their way to eventual membership. When I got on board, there was also this sort of hulking man sitting off in the side, standing over the servers watching as the dinner was being served. I had no idea who he was. I paid very little attention to him. It was only years later, remembering this and digging out the photograph of that moment, that I realized that it was, in fact, Yevgeny Prigozhin in his days as a restaurateur, before he worked on creating the Internet Research Agency to try to influence the 2016 election, before he created and denied creating the Wagner Group, before he entered the Ukraine war, and before he spent a otherwise perfectly nice Saturday afternoon trying to march on Moscow, which turned out to be his undoing. This scene plays out in the first chapter of the book because it puts most of the key characters right in place at the time. And I went back later on and interviewed Condoleezza Rice and others who had been on the yacht that day to sort of reconstruct the conversation. And when you look back at it now, that was the high point. That was the moment when Putin, I think, probably had not yet decided whether he was going to join the West or become a force of disruption. But by 2007, he had made up his mind, and he showed up at the Munich Security Conference and gave a speech in which he said there are parts of Russia that have been wrested away from the country that need to return, that there are parts of NATO that have been gathered together that need to be disassembled so they are not a threat to us. It was a very fiery speech, and Bob Gates, then the defense secretary, former CIA head, stood up after Putin was done and said, you know, I lived through one entire Cold War. It wasn't really that much fun, and I've got no interest in bringing it back. And for the next 3 presidencies, we heard President Bush, President Obama, even Donald Trump say at various moments, I have no interest in going back to a Cold War. We certainly heard that in the early days of the Biden administration. But I've argued in the book that that's actually where we find ourselves today. 7 years after that speech in Munich, Putin took over, annexed Crimea, and sent the little green men, the ununiformed or out of uniform Russian military, into southern Ukraine. It took a year for the European allies and the US to agree on a set of sanctions against the Russians, and when they imposed them, they didn't do a whole lot of damage. And the next year, 2015, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, signed the Nord Stream 2 agreement with the Russians. This created a pipeline for Russian gas that ran around Ukraine, so the Ukrainians got none of the value and had no control over it, and directly into Europe. And Merkel declared that Putin was a reliable supplier. So it was hardly unreasonable that Vladimir Putin would have concluded, based on this experience, that if he decided to go for all of Ukraine, it would take the West months or a year to work up a response, and that at the end of the day, they really wouldn't challenge him. He got that wrong. In one of the really most remarkable things I've covered as a national security correspondent, the administration, the Biden administration, slowly leaked out evidence that we could corroborate that the Russians were building up along the Ukraine border and had every intention of invading. The Americans I interviewed were completely certain of it. The Europeans, up until the weekend before the invasion, completely dismissed it. They told me, it was at another Munich Security Conference, this of course was in 2022, in February, that the Russians would not invade. And in fact, that is what President Zelensky, arriving on an unmarked Pentagon-provided plane so that he wouldn't be shot down by the Russians, told the assembled group, and then that what he told Vice President Kamala Harris at the same meeting. The Saturday before the invasion at Munich, I sat down and had breakfast with Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State. And as we were having breakfast, we started discussing, listing all of the European leaders who had told us, him in his formal bilaterals, me in separate interviews, that there would be no invasion. It was a really long list. And at one moment, Tony turned to me and he said, Secretary Blinken turned to me and said, you know, David, I can't tell you what day the invasion's going to come, but it's going to come in the next couple of days. And of course, by that Thursday, that's exactly what happened. And it was somewhat remarkable to see how quickly President Biden assembled the group of allies that have been pursuing that war since. And it was going pretty well until the counteroffensive of the past year failed, and the Russians finally built up the mass that has made them far more successful than they had been in recent months. We'll come back to that. But meanwhile, there was a parallel story going on this side of the world with President Xi, because China was democratizing slowly, mostly in local areas, was liberalizing until Xi came along. And we read him completely wrong. It wasn't for lack of trying. As vice president, Joe Biden was given the assignment of getting to know Vice President Xi Jinping, and he traveled in China with Xi. Xi came to the United States. He traveled in the U.S. and went back to Iowa to a family house that he had visited when President Xi was a young agricultural official. He presented as somebody who really did not want to challenge the West. His daughter was going to Harvard at the time as an undergraduate under an assumed name, but he was one of many Chinese leaders who were sending their kids to Ivy League schools to understand the U.S. And all the intelligence reports at the time suggested that President Xi would focus on the domestic economy and not challenge the U.S. Those all turned out to be wrong. And now what is happening is that the U.S. finds itself in a position where China and Russia are gathering together in an uneasy partnership, as I said early on, to go confront the United States and its allies. And that is the world that I think we are going to be seeing for the next several decades. It took the U.S. several years to come to the conclusion, and really only came to that conclusion in the past year and a half, that this partnership between Russia and China is real. The Europeans have only gotten there in the past, I would say, 6 to 8 months, since China began providing significant technology to Russia for the war. And it has only been in the past few months that the allies have begun to discuss how you would try to go disrupt that kind of relationship. I asked President Biden about this at his last press conference, in part to see if he had developed a strategy. He fumbled around with the answer a little bit at the beginning, but when we finally drew him back to it, he said, yes, David, we are trying to interrupt that relationship, but I'm not prepared to tell you how, which left everybody with the impression that a good part of the policy is covert. If the United States and Australia go ahead fully with AUKUS as planned, AUKUS will be part of that environment. It will be involved in getting in the midst of the Russia-China relationship, and will put Australia right in the middle of what may be the most complex geopolitical problem they have faced for some time. So that's where we are headed. In our Q&A, I look forward to talking to you about what some of the possibilities are for all of this. I'm sure that we'll end up talking a little bit about the election as well, and the selection just in recent hours of Tim Walz, somebody who has spent a fair bit of time in China as a young man and who has thought a fair bit about it when he was in Congress. On the central issue of our time, I think he's probably one of the leaders in Congress, or former members of Congress, who've thought about this more intensely than most. But we're also headed into a pretty perilous moment. Perilous in the United States for all the obvious reasons, perilous around the world because the new Cold Wars are going to be a lot harder to manage than the old. So I'll leave it at that, and look forward, Andrew, to your questions and the questions of your colleagues. It's really great to be among such a vibrant Australian journalistic community. I hope you treat me more gently than you treat your usual political subject. But I can take, I signed up for this, so I'll just have to take whatever is dealt out. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me.
Well, the good thing, David, because you're not a politician, you can answer hypothetical questions for us.
Yeah.
So, as you said, we're in the election season. We will have a new US president come what may, January 20. Of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, which one is best equipped, in your view, to handle this new Cold War with China and Russia?
Really interesting question, because their approaches are quite different, and the difference that you see most vividly, of course, is in the case of Russia. Former President Trump has said that he would solve the Ukraine war issue in 24 hours. In fact, he said during that debate, it was a little hard to remember this because we were all so focused on Biden at the moment, but what he said was he would actually work on negotiating that end during the transition before he became president, which I think is a violation of U.S. law, but we'd have to separate that out. And look, there's only one way I can imagine that President Trump could solve the problem in 24 hours, and that would be essentially to talk to Putin about what Putin wants or would settle for. And Putin's been pretty clear about that. He wants the roughly 20% of the country that the Russian troops have already controlled, maybe a little bit more than that, including those 4 provinces that he has declared annexed to Russia. The way you end the war in 24 hours is you then call up the Ukrainians and say, you're going to sign up to that territorial deal, because if you don't, you're going to lose the US-led support. And that's why you have seen NATO running around trying to, for lack of a better word, kind of Trump-proof some of the aid by creating a separate mechanism through NATO and a Ukraine NATO command that would be separate from the United States and could continue to provide aid even if the US pulled out. But let's not kid ourselves. The technology and the intelligence cooperation that Ukraine needs runs through the Pentagon. And if a future President Trump in a second term decided that he was going to force a solution to this and use the cutoff of that aid, both intelligence, money, reconstruction, and of course arms, he would have great leeway to go do it. China's a little bit more complex issue because there is more continuity than the Biden folks would like to admit to the strategy that they have put together. Biden has not reversed any of the sanctions, for example, that were placed on China. He has designed a 2-part strategy, Andrew, your paper has written a lot about, and we have as well, which is to try to deny the Chinese both the most advanced chips that they need for artificial intelligence, weapons development, supercomputing, quantum computing. These are the chips with the smallest architectures, below 7 nanometer dimensions of the circuits. And he has denied them the equipment to make those chips themselves, which are mostly equipment made in the Netherlands and some in Japan and South Korea. These are the $100 million ASML machines that sit right in the middle of any semiconductor fab. Meanwhile, what President Biden has done, and this got its start in the Trump administration, I think we have to give them credit for it, but Biden accelerated it dramatically, is getting many of these companies to begin to build fabs in the United States, because our reliance on the chips that are inside your iPhone, just about every iPhone, and that are used for all the other applications I described, are almost all coming out of Taiwan Semiconductor. And if you had designed as a business plan the idea that you would take the most valuable single technology that underlies your most critical products and put it on a vulnerable island 100 miles off the shores of your largest adversary, and then said, I'm sure this will work out fine, I suspect you wouldn't have been able to go ahead with that business plan. But that's essentially where we found ourselves. And what worries me is that by Biden's own estimate, if they are completely successful in getting these plants online, the U.S. will be able to produce 20% of the most advanced chips in the U.S. by 2030. I don't think they're going to hit that mark, but let's be generous and say they get 15%, up from 0 right now. And if they do, that means that in a Taiwan conflict, we would still be dependent on Taiwan and thus China for 85% of that production. That doesn't seem to me like a tenable industrial strategy.
Maybe not a time to upgrade your phone.
Yeah. If you don't drop your phone if Taiwan gets invaded, is I guess the lesson.
Our first question from the floor, David Crowe.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, David, for your remarks. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. I think I'll just stay on that theme there, because the logical next question is, what is your outlook, or how would you sum up the outlook in Washington now on Taiwan? Are we heading for an eventual conflict in the Taiwan Straits? Is this somewhere where the new Cold War will take us? What's your assessment of that?
So there is a widespread assumption that we are headed in that direction, but it is not inevitable. The assumption that we are headed there, David, comes from the thought that Xi Jinping is now 70 years old. He has said that he will solve this problem once and for all before he leaves office. We don't know how long he's going to be in office, but let's say that he could reasonably run the country till age, let me pull a number out of a hat, say 81. And that would tell you that if he's serious about trying to go do this, you know, we've got just slightly more than a decade to go figure this out. Now, a lot can happen between now and then. I think China's own economic slowdown and Xi's necessity to go focus on building up the domestic economy has bought Taiwan some time. The question is, are we going to use that time wisely? Secondly, there's a big division of opinion in Washington about what a squeeze on Taiwan would look like. The easy scenario is a straight-on invasion, although there's nothing easy for the Chinese about doing an invasion of a country that requires moving across 100 miles of sea, and nothing easy for us about reinforcing from 3,000 or 4,000 miles away. And same for Australia, if Australia chose to get involved, and that's a big if. The alternative scenario, though, David, and the one that I would think would be the one I would worry about the most, is the slow squeeze. The declaration by China that Taiwan is part of China and therefore part of its customs area, that all ships and shipments and air flights coming into Taiwan had to first go to Shanghai or some other port for clearance, and thus a slow stranglehold. And, you know, the model here of moving slowly but inexorably is what happened in Hong Kong. Now, Taiwan would be a very different and more complex issue. But if you did it that way, it might not create an immediate point of crisis the way an invasion would, that would trigger the United States and its allies to debate whether or not they are going to go intervene. And, you know, I think this is going to be the hardest issue in the future for the Australian-US relationship, because while Australia has signed up to AUKUS, and while it may play out over the next 2 decades, both in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of cooperation, I don't get the sense, with all the expertise I've garnered from being here for 4 days, that Australia has fully decided whether or not it considers Taiwan to be part of its central and essential strategic interest.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up?
Doesn't mind. No problem for me. If it works for Andrew, it works for me.
I've got clearance from Andrew, so I'll forge ahead.
A quick one.
You said if Australia gets involved. Now, Canada famously did not get involved in Iraq. Australia sent troops to Iraq to join its most important ally. Do you think the view from Washington is that Australia really does have a choice on Taiwan?
I'm not sure that people in Washington have really sort of concentrated on that yet, because to them it really is hypothetical, as Andrew said, and we don't know what this would look like, the degree of economic reliance on exports to China at that time, the degree of reliance on imports from particularly chip imports. Australia is not a producer of semiconductors right now, and thus, you know, is coming to this as somebody who would be 100% reliant on imports for advanced technologies that it would need. Clearly, what Biden has tried to do is put together what Jake Sullivan calls the lattice work of the U.S. National Security Advisor, the lattice work of a Pacific alliance. They don't say a Pacific NATO because it's not that kind of tight relationship. But think about what Biden's done, and it's been somewhat remarkable. He's gotten South Korea and Japan to set aside 70 years of arguments about Japan's activities during World War II and during the previous Japanese occupation of Korea, to work together and begin to do even military planning together. It's brought the Philippines in. There was an interesting meeting in Washington a few months ago of the Japanese, South Korean, and Philippine leaders. There's a Pacific Islands initiative that I write about in the book that I don't think has been enormously successful, but at least has been the first U.S. pushback on Chinese influence from, you know, every place that we are concerned about. I write a lot about the Solomon Islands. Interesting, I was in the Solomons for the 50th, I shouldn't say this, it dates me, for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Guadalcanal. I remember everybody was awaiting the arrival of the guy who had saved John F. Kennedy, and he did not paddle into town. And they explained as we were sitting in Honiara with its single traffic light at the time that he hates the big city. But by the time the 75th anniversary came, and the then Deputy Secretary of State and Caroline Kennedy, the ambassador here, showed up in the Solomons, the top leadership of the islands never came out of their offices because they did not want to anger the Chinese. So I think it's going to be it's going to require a lot of building over the next few years to get that alliance sealed up. And to relate it to your first question, if President Trump comes back, alliance building I've never noticed is sort of at the top of his agenda.
Thank you. Next question from Jacob Gruber.
Thank you. Jacob Gruber from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. It's what happens, Andrew, when you let them have a second question. They take my question. But I am going to bounce off David's theme. When I was sent to the United States as a correspondent in 2018, one of the first phrases that I heard from a think tank was decoupling. And I thought at the time it was kind of crazy in an economic sense. I think that phrase now is pretty mainstream in the United States and here. It's kind of used very lightly as though it's a thing that can happen easily in a lot of the debates. We sit here, and many people in this room spend a lot of time wondering whether we can trust America. Is it a good idea to throw everything into the ship that is the United States in its current state, which, as others have pointed out, is a pretty wild ride, anyone who spends 5 minutes watching. What if we as a country actually did decide our bread is buttered in China? We get everything from China. They make great stuff. It's cheap. Why would we put our economic relationship so closely with the United States? We'd be swapping one dependency for another. Would anyone notice in Washington, what would the reaction be, and would you blame us?
Great question. Direct, I would say. So let me start with your first part, which is decoupling, because decoupling essentially means separating the two economies, the dependencies, and so forth. Let's face it, we can't decouple. The United States can't decouple. My evidence for this is walk into a Walmart, okay, and ask yourself what decoupling would look like. It would look like empty shelves, okay? So decoupling isn't going to happen. So instead, in Washington, you can do two things when you have a problem like this. You can discuss that reality, or you can invent a new phrase. So they invented a new phrase. And the new phrase used in Washington in the past few years has been de-risking. What is the difference, you ask? De-risking is a version of what I described before, which is begin to build your own facilities so that, and your own fabs and so forth, so that you are lowering the risk level. You are not separating from China, but you're creating alternative supply chains. And God knows during COVID, we all learned that the supply chains we had were pretty risky, right? We suddenly discovered we were dependent on China for things as basic as medical masks, that we were dependent on them for all kinds of other materials. And so de-risking is trying to hedge your bets some. And I think you're seeing Australia do a bit of that as well. And there's obviously a lot of political discussion here about whether or not you are too dependent on China as a single customer or a major customer for much of your goods, and also as a supplier. The second part of your question is a harder one, which is why not simply join up with China? What I found when I was working on the book was this got expressed to me in different ways by different countries. India has been the most reluctant, for example, to sign on to this highly American approach. Even close allies like Singapore have been. And one diplomat said to me, I think it's the title of a chapter in the book now, said, why make us choose? Why can't we maintain a relationship, a defense relationship with the United States, and a full economic relationship with China? And the answer to that question is that the line between what we used to consider to be defense relationships and economic relationships has now so blurred that it's very difficult to go pull apart the elements. this is the core of the argument about Huawei, a telecoms producer. The American, British, European worry about Huawei, and certainly the worry here in Australia, where you have ripped out most of your Huawei equipment, is that if you got into a conflict, China could turn off or divert much of your telecommunications capability. And so that's an example of de-risking. So I think the Americans would say to you something a little bit different, a future administration. Would they ignore it? No. Would they say, do you want to become so dependent on China that if there was a conflict, China would give you the choice between continuing to stay connected to the rest of the world or signing up with them on their side of events, or at least staying out of your alliance with the United States? And that's going to require some really hard decisions and scenario building of things that could, worst case scenarios for the next number of years. My sense of Australia is it is so rooted in the West. It is such a product of its relationship with the West that it would be a very hard decision to say, no, we're going to be on the China side of this equation, with all that that might mean if China is able to realize its own ambitions to become the largest military, economic, cultural, and technological power in the world by 2049, which would be the 100th anniversary of the revolution.
Thank you.
Next question from Kim Bergman.
Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. Thank you very much for all of that. Could I ask you to place yourself for a moment in the role of a Vegemite-eating Australian?
Mm-hmm.
Would it be wise to believe that a future US president, under all circumstances, would authorise the sale to Australia of US nuclear-powered submarines?
Would authorize the
sale to Australia of nuclear-powered submarines?
I'm not sure that every American president would do it. I think a lot of it would have to do with the argument that would inevitably take place in Washington about whether or not there were spare nuclear-powered submarines to sell. But under AUKUS, you've got, what is it, 5 or 6 that are supposed to be coming, 5. And that's stretched out over the next 15 years, basically.
You know? Shorter, but...
Is it shorter than that?
Yes.
Okay. I can easily imagine that happening. But I could also imagine people standing up in Congress and saying, we can't afford to give these up yet, and, you know, trying to stretch the timeline. I'm worried about something a little bit longer and deeper than that, which is when AUKUS was signed, the concept was that the future conflicts with China or other adversaries would be fought with the kind of submarines that we've been using now for 30 or 40 years. And even the submarines you would get would probably be a combination of new and refurbished. And yet, when you talk to the people who are thinking about advanced weaponry in the Pentagon, they are talking about a submarine fleet that looks nothing like what we have today. It would be almost entirely unmanned. It would be submarines that would sit on the floor of the Taiwan Strait, ready to pop up either in surveillance mode or attack mode if there was a move against Taiwan. They would be much less vulnerable to being detected. There's a lot of concern in the Pentagon right now that AI tools combined with undersea sonar will get rid of a lot of the protection that submarines have now against being detected. And the US is quite concerned about protecting its own fleet of nuclear-armed submarines. So my bigger worry is not that you won't get supplied with them. My bigger worry is that if you do get supplied with them, you may feel like you have the submarines for a conflict imagined 30 years ago, instead of the submarines you need, which may mean a largely unmanned fleet.
Thank you.
Our next question from Anthony Galloway.
Thank you, Anthony Galloway from Capital Brief. Thank you for your address. When I was heading to Ukraine in 2022, a few days after Russia's invasion, I was fully expecting my phone not to work and to have to resort to the big satellite phone that I was bringing into the country with me. You cover in your book quite closely this expectation that Ukraine was going to go dark, either just before the invasion or during, and that didn't really come to pass. And the conflict ended up looking, a lot like conflicts of the past. There's a great quote in your book after talking with Mark Milley, where you say, it's part 1914, part 1941, and part 2022. I was just wondering if you can unpack for us why you think cyber weapons didn't play the big part that we perhaps thought in Ukraine. Did we overstate the importance of cyber once a conflict turns hot? And what does it say about any potential future conflicts?
This is such a great question, and I deal with it at several points in the book. So there was some cyber activity prior to this. In fact, we profile in the book a U.S. Cyber Command unit that was going out to try to make the country more resilient. And of course, the Russians took down a European satellite network without ever attacking it in space. Instead, what they did was attack the ground stations and the modems for those stations so that they couldn't communicate with them. A lesson that I suspect resonated with the Australian Signals Directorate, among others, because who would know that if you go out to Alice Springs, you might find similar kinds of facilities out there. But you raised the central question, which is, as I wrote in my last book, The Perfect Weapon, cyber is a terrific short-of-war weapon. In other words, you can use it before conflict to go degrade your adversary, to make life miserable for them, to send signals of warning to them. But what we learned in the Ukraine war was that once a conflict actually begins, it's not the most efficient way to destroy things. It's useful if you're trying to avoid getting to armed conflict, but once you're in armed conflict, it may make more sense to put a missile through an electric power supply system or substation than it is to try to work for a couple of months to break into it with the right code and slow it down or turn it off. And that's a lesson that is just now sort of being absorbed by militaries around the world. Mark Milley was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was quite vivid, and I'll clean up the language here since we're not only talking among ourselves but to a live television audience. But he said, we thought at first this was going to be a clean cyber war. Then we thought it was a World War II style tank war. And then we discovered it was blanking trench warfare from World War I. And when you went into his office, when he was in the Pentagon still, he kept two pictures up on his wall. And they were both of men in trenches covered in mud and dust. And he would challenge you when you came in to go figure out which one of these pictures was from World War I and which one was from Ukraine. So we have a lot to learn about the interaction. I wouldn't overlearn the lesson, because if the Russians go ahead and do what the U.S. believes they're getting ready to do and put a nuclear weapon in space and threaten to detonate it, you would discover, both in short of war and in war situations, what it would be like to live with no satellite communications and no satellite surveillance and no satellite command and control.
Thank you. Our next question, Jason Katsoukis.
David, Jason Katsoukis from the Saturday paper. Thanks very much for your speech. My wanted to ask you what your assessment of the Quad is. Do you think it's making a difference? And does it have a future under a Trump or a Harris administration?
So the Quad is part of what Secretary of State Blinken calls creating new geometries in diplomacy, which is have small sub-gatherings of countries. I mentioned some before, which was putting the Philippines and Japan together. The Quad, obviously, putting together Australia and India and so forth. And I think they can be fit for purpose. I'm having a hard time imagining a future Trump administration putting a lot of effort into that, because they tend to focus on the bilateral relationship much more than the alliance building piece of this. I would see no reason that that a President Harris would abandon it. She was in on this discussion and visited Asia, 3 or 4 times as vice president. And I suspect those structures that began in the Biden administration, she would probably keep going.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next question, Nicholas Kansu.
Kansu.
Kansu, thank you.
Nick Kansu from the Australian Associated Press. So we've heard a fair bit today about the evils that Russia and China have done in the modern era, but I think it ought to be underlined that since the last Cold War, we've seen from what the world has seen from the United States is the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent destabilizing of the Middle East, which what that's culminated in most recently is the one of America's allies doing the invasion of Gaza, killing like tens of thousands of people. So I guess to phrase this as a question, to what extent do you think a legitimate fear from a lot of the world of what the US could potentially do in a coming Cold War is going to play into things? Absolutely.
Look, we were not blameless in the Cold War itself, and the United States will certainly not be blameless in the new Cold Wars. Iraq, and I've written previous books on this, and I discuss it a little bit in New Cold Wars, was probably the greatest strategic error the United States has made in a century. And thinking that staying in Afghanistan with a small force would result in anything different over the past 10 years was, probably a lesser mistake, but a mistake as well, and one that I think seriously set back American credibility when the eventual exit was resulted in the deaths of 13 Americans and was clearly such a messy withdrawal. The Biden administration, when it came in, thought that it could separate itself out from getting wrapped up in the Mideast. And basically, Biden made no secret of all of this. He said, we're going to de-emphasize the Middle East and focus on the pivot to Asia. How many presidents have you heard tell you that they were going to go focus on the pivot to Asia? And there's a new book out by Richard Fontaine and Bob Blackwell that I suggest that you take a look at about why the pivot's been so difficult to execute, and the Mideast is a piece of that. But to some degree, the dynamic that is running there is parallel to and intersects with, but not a central part of the revival of superpower conflict. I think it could become such if China and Russia decide to exploit it more through their relationship with Iran. But right now, it isn't a central piece of it. To your broader point, has the U.S. lost a large amount of its moral authority to organize the world that it had during the Cold War? I think it has lost some, although I think it lost as much or more in Vietnam, right, with American abuses there. We just learned of the death a few weeks ago of one of the central figures in the My Lai massacre, but certainly that massacre undercut American authority as well. And there were even errors in the way we fought and ended the Korean War. So, superpowers make big mistakes, and the United States is no exception to that. I think the fundamental question you have to ask yourself, though, is if you believe the new Cold Wars are going to go on for the next 30 or 40 years, that will outlast Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, do you want a world at the end of that is based more on Western values or based more on Russian and Chinese authoritarian values? And that's the hard question, because it's not a choice of whether or not the U.S. is a blameless leader. Certainly the U.S. is not. The question is, what is your alternative?
And
Thank you.
Still time for a couple more questions. Andrew Green.
David Sanger, Andrew Green, also from the ABC. There's a saying in Australian journalism circles that if you want to know, particularly in military affairs, what the Australians are doing, ask the Americans. And that's a reflection on the culture in this country of secrecy and not as much transparency. In your country, you do, for all its faults, though, have a constitutional right to freedom of speech and a commitment to a bit more transparency. I want to get your reflections as a veteran and someone who has been in this part of the world through your time in Tokyo of Australia's dealings in national security in terms of information publicly, and whether this country is suffering as a result of that perceived secrecy.
The secrecy is definitely significant. I wouldn't say that the U.S. is exactly an open book. And, the fact that so many Americans were shocked by the WikiLeaks disclosures about the Pentagon and then of the State Department, and then the Snowden disclosures about the operations of the NSA and some of its allies, tells you that for all of our vaunted openness, we're not all that wildly open. The British system and the Australian system bear more resemblance to each other than they do to the American, because there is this tradition of sort of Official Secrets Act. I'm not sure some of the journalism that I have done, including revealing the U.S. operations against the Iranian nuclear program using cyber means, the Olympic Games program or Stuxnet, I don't think I could have done that, written those stories in an Australian or British environment. The United States is unusual in having a First Amendment, and it's one of the reasons that American journalists are so fierce in its defense. But do I think that Australian democracy has irreparably suffered from this? No, largely because of the great efforts of many of you here in this room. It still has a vibrant, and I would say by most global standards, extremely free press. I don't think it's as free as the U.S. But actually what I worry about in the United States is that the loss of so many journalistic outlets, particularly at the local level, is doing more damage to our transparency than anything the government can do. And that's why we've seen so many movements, including one inside the New York Times, led by our former executive editor, Dean Baquet, to go try to build up local journalism. Because big institutions like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post are not going to go find the corrupt local sewer commissioner or cover, disputes within a school board. That's only going to happen at the local level. And then the distrust in media becomes a big piece of this. I think there is more trust in local media usually than there is in national media. I don't know if that's as true in Australia as it is in the U.S., but it is certainly a feature in the U.S. market.
Okay. Just finally, only last couple of minutes, but Who's going to win the election in November?
Great question. So we finally got to an election question at the very end. So it's been, as I said at the beginning, a really remarkable 4 weeks. I was too young during the 1968 election when Johnson pulled out, and then, you know, the chaos of the Chicago Convention. And I'm going to be at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in just a few weeks, 2 weeks from now. But I'm not sure since 1968 we have had such tumult. I've been surprised by a couple of things in the past couple of weeks, and I'll just tell you what I got wrong. I did not think that Kamala Harris could put together within the party enough support quickly enough to basically avoid having an open convention fight for the nomination. I was completely wrong. She did that much more skillfully than I had expected and that many of my colleagues had expected. And in fact, in the day or two after Biden's announcement, we all thought that there would be an open fight through to the convention. And many people argued that would be a good thing, that there needed to be a contest, not a coronation. But she seems to have executed it and gotten the party behind her. In Tim Walz as a running mate, she gains a few things and loses a few things. First of all, I think the Democratic Party has had a real problem with the middle of the country. It is viewed as the party of Eastern elites who are more interested in climate change, more interested in abortion rights, though less so on that issue, in LGBT rights, in a wide variety of issues than Democrats in much of the middle of the country. Walz pushes against that some. You know, he is grew up in a town of, I think, 150 or 200 people at one point. He's been in the military. He's been a football coach. He didn't go to an Ivy League school, a point that he's been making about J.D. Vance. I think his line was, the hillbillies that I grew up with didn't go to Yale. That was his. I kind of like that line, but then again, I went to Harvard. So, I think that gains her a fair bit. Where it was a lost opportunity was we thought that she would choose somebody who would move her more to the center and redefine her more to the center. And that would have been Governor Shapiro from Pennsylvania. It would have been Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona. And she chose not to do that. If she wins Pennsylvania anyway without Shapiro and wins the election, I think this will be regarded months from now, Jared and I were discussing this on our way in, as something of a brilliant choice. If she loses Pennsylvania and is on the way to losing the entire election, I think people will revisit this choice in a really big way. The momentum is certainly on her side right now. And that results in some really interesting things. Former President Trump was pretty much on message about his view that the economy was better, and most Americans tell pollsters the economy was better. I'm not sure the statistics bear that out, during his time and so forth, when he thought he had a comfortable lead, or at least a lead, over Joe Biden. Now that the polls have moved right, into essentially a virtual tie on the national level, we haven't gotten good enough polling yet on the battleground states. You're seeing him basically revert back to his old attack lines, which is, why you heard him get involved in the debate about whether or not she recently discovered that she was black, or whether she had defined herself as Indian American prior to that. There's no evidence I've seen that she had done so. But this is all part of what you have seen in the Trump playbook when he was questioning Barack Obama's birth certificate, right, and demanding to see the birth certificate and so forth. It is the creation of the thought of otherness, right, that somehow this candidate is different and other than most Americans. And while she has rejected that and so forth, in picking Tim Walz, she has picked somebody who is immune from that particular line of attack. So instead, they're going to have to go back and argue that he is wildly liberal. And I think you began to already see some of that in the hours since he was named. Their bet here is that the things that he is known for, free school lunches, very heavy support for abortion rights up to basically the limits of Roe v. Wade, the Roe v. Wade case, and so forth, is something that in the end will win over in the battleground states and will win over moderates. And I think, you know, the sub-theme of their run will be, this is the anti-weird ticket, or at least, you know, not full of what they would regard as crazy ideas. And the theme of the Trump administration, of the Trump campaign, is going to be, this would bring a group of wild liberals back, California-driven, Minnesota-driven liberals back in charge of the country. So one cannot argue here that the country doesn't have a clear ideological choice and a clear foreign policy set of differences as well. And I guess I should conclude by saying that, you know, I think America First will be back as a significant debating point here, because Walz, having spent a lot of time dealing with China and so forth, as I suggested at the beginning, I think has pretty clear views on that. And so here I probably ought to conclude, Andrew, with a confession, which has to do with America First. I get asked about this a lot in the United States, probably less known in Australia. President Trump, as a candidate in 2016, wasn't using the America First phraseology until the spring of 2016 when he was running. And I think he would have gotten there anyway earlier, but I think I played a small and unintentional role in this, and I send it to you as a warning signal to my fellow journalists. Maggie Haberman and I were interviewing Trump for the first of 2 long interviews on his foreign policy views. We didn't feel like we needed to do Hillary Clinton. She had been Secretary of State. We understood her views. But we had written to Trump and said, we don't know very much about yours. And he immediately sent back a message and actually called me on my cell phone and said, oh, this is terrific. We'll talk about foreign policy. So on a Friday afternoon, we finally sit down and had this long interview with him. And we begin to get the, oh, yes, you know, we have a trade deficit with Japan and South Korea. So if that doesn't get solved, I'm pulling all our troops back. Well, sir, do you mind then if they get their own nuclear weapons, if they don't think they're under our nuclear umbrella? Thinks about it for a moment, says, no, that'll be fine. I've got no problem with that. Conversation goes on with what you would expect on immigration. I asked him when, in his view, when was America's greatest moment? He thought the 1950s, which was kind of interesting, and it tells you a little bit about his mindset. And then I made my mistake. Here I was trying to think about how Maggie and I would write this story thematically, and we had to like meet the deadline for the Sunday paper, and it was late Friday afternoon. And so I made the mistake, you can find the transcript of this, said to him essentially, you know, sir, it sounds to me like you are going back to something similar to the old America First policy, thinking he would say, I'm no Lindbergh, I'm not trying to be an isolationist, and so forth. But it turns out he hadn't heard about the Lindbergh America First movement. So instead, he said to me, you know, I kind of like the sound of that. I mean, what national leader would not want their country to be first? Not just Americans, but any. I thought, oh, okay. So I moved on. We had a little mention of it in our story on Sunday. And the next Monday morning, I go down into their kitchen and I flip on the morning news, and it was Morning Joe or CNN or something, and they were running clips from a rally he had given the previous night. And there he is yelling, America first, America first. As I said, I think he would have gotten there later in the campaign, but I have to confess to some role in perhaps in speeding it up. And then my wife came down, and this is running, and I poured her a cup of coffee, and she took a sip of it. And then with that searing set of lines that only a spouse can deliver, she looked at me and she said, I hope you're really proud of yourself. So there's the risk.
With that, I think that's your contribution to making journalism great again.
Yes.
So everyone, please thank David Sanger for his time. It's been a fantastic address.